And in just a few minutes, Terry and I are going to talk about some particular interactions of the gospel. It may be a little cultural commentary of gospel preaching in some ways, but we'll get to that in a second. So we're talking about evangelism, preacher stuff here shortly. Before we do that, before that actually goes down, couple things that I want to start with is to thank people for watching this conversation for way too many times. I'm saying at the end of our broadcast too. We're in year 3, episode 11 of the nonsense in which we engage in. It's pretty silly. Beyond that, I do have a question for Terry today that I think is a fun little question that maybe we'll just think about in different ways going forward, like as a regular thing. It's like a two-parter, and I think it's very Terry. What's the best thing you ate last week, Terry? That's all it is. It's real simple.
The best thing I ate last week?
Yeah.
The Sunday count?
If it was last Sunday, that's like 2 days ago. That's not last week.
Oh, last week. Like, I got to remember the best thing I ate last week? Wow. That is not fair.
You want the other half of the question?
So, no, I know what it was. Corned beef. Which is funny because, now I didn't get it till Friday night just because St. Patrick's Day was Wednesday. It's tough. Thursday we had soccer, so Friday night was corned beef. And we have this discussion every year. I don't know why, but we only fix corned beef once a year, and we always like it. But we only fix it once a year because it's like the St. Patrick's Day meal. So corned beef,
very good,
full bore.
I did have a smoked pork butt, which is on the list of the top 2. I think it probably is the top 1. But I've taken this habit of having sandwiches a couple times a week, and trying to induce the habit of putting smashed avocado on them all the time.
Wait a minute. So you've gone from tacos to sandwiches?
Oh, no, I still have tacos.
Okay.
I didn't give anything up for Lent. Let's just be accurate.
Yes. What's the second part of the question?
What's something interesting you read last week? That's really nerdy, nerdy tidbits.
Nerdy tidbits.
I got one ready for you. It's also food related. It doesn't have to be biblical.
Okay, so I don't have to look like I'm super spiritual.
No, absolutely not. Why would we lie?
Yeah.
There's a guy on YouTube that's super spiritual. He's quite interesting.
One thing I read last week was trying to think because we could
reframe it as what did you learn? Something interesting you learned last week. Because if you read, you should be learning. I think that's a fair thing.
I didn't learn a thing. I'm kidding, obviously. I mean, the biggest thing I learned the last couple of weeks is not to put your hand into a saw blade. But beyond that, which was not reading, obviously. Yeah. So I've been reading a book a little bit called "Once Delivered, Forever Established: The Certainty of the Holy Scriptures" by Doug Burleson. So.
Oh, good, excellent.
Yeah. But I know people. I hate to ruin the image that I don't know how to read. So.
Well, it's not about if you can read. It's do you read? So that's a shift there.
Yep.
Anyway, give me mine, and mine's really super simple. I learned something that should be pretty obvious, but there is more square inches of pizza.
Oh, I saw this.
18-inch
yes
pizza than
large.
2 12-inch pizzas.
Yes. Which is funny because you think you do pizza math and you're like, oh, we'll just get 2 mediums.
Yeah. what you're doing is you're giving up crust space for interior space.
Yes.
And so you're going to make that choice now based on what you prefer more. Do
And
you
you're
like
paying
that
a lot
crusty
more
edge?
money.
Yeah.
You're paying a lot more money.
Not always. Some places will do deals on 2 mediums versus 1 large.
Yeah, but there's usually 1 topping, and that's never enough.
That actual calculation matters when you're trying to feed large group of teenagers.
Yeah.
And so you just need to know that going forward, that your net outcome is going to be better served by more larges rather than a bazillion mediums. Correct. Unless you prefer crust. Now, if you want crust space, then the 212s give you the maximum crust quantity if that's your goal.
Well, time to start. Hal Hammonds is logged in, so we're good to go.
That means we can get into the serious, in-depth dialogue that we have planned. We've been working on this for 2-3 minutes.
I don't even think that long.
Yeah. So what we want to talk about today is a little bit about evangelism from a slightly different angle than we've covered before. We've talked about evangelism in the digital media context. We've talked about evangelism as like, what do I teach? We've talked about it like, what's my methodology in those settings? And we'll probably talk about the differences that Terry and I have in those approaches at different points too, because I know we use a different model. We do different things. We sit down and talk to people about God because we are different.
No.
I need to establish my difference from Terry. I need to get a little independence. But let's talk about it this way. This is one of the things we brought up in our pre-roll conversation space. I think there's a struggle amongst people who are, I think, very well-intentioned, very focused on trying to help people understand who God is, that we've created this model that says, if I talk to someone who is dealing with this particular sinful lifestyle, and I use that very generically, and I apologize if it's not the way you want to frame things to those who are kind of listening to this. If I don't have the right package of information ahead of time, I can't reach them because my stuff will only work for the person who fits these 2 or 3 criteria to begin with. So if I talk to a murderer, I got to talk to that person different than when I talk to someone who is an adulterer. If I talk to an adulterer, that's different than talking to a fornicator. And I'm using very precise biblical terms there because I think it's important to grapple with it holistically as we go forward.
Well, there's also a whole segment of people that just won't talk to some of those people. Let's be honest. Like, if I have to choose somebody who's been in 1 marriage, 3 kids, wealthy, lives on the right side of town, has a good job, versus the homosexual or the adulterer or somebody who lives on the wrong side of the tracks, I'm going to take the wife, 3 kids guy over the other. And I think that's, well, I'm going to use fishing as a illustration of this, by the way. So when you go fishing today, Phil, you fish typically for a specific species of fish. And you fish for species differently today. If I'm going to fish for catfish, I'm going to put weight on the hook. I'm going to put a bigger hook. I'm going to sink that to the bottom. And I'm going to use something that's pretty gross. It's going to be stink bait, or it can even be a hot dog, or it can be a night crawler. But I'm gonna drop that line all the way to the bottom, and I'm gonna try to get in a channel if I can, because that's where the cats normally are gonna hang out. If I want a bass, I'm gonna try to get under some stumps, and I'm not gonna let that sink as far, depending on the temperature. If it's crappie, I'm going to go into a crappie bed, and it's going to be about this time of the year, and I'm going to use completely different lures and a completely different rod than if I'm fishing for catfish. So if you fish seriously, when you go fishing, you change your rods, your lures, your location. You may even change the kind of boat you take sometimes based on what you are fishing for. Okay? And I think we take that approach with us into evangelism. Right? We think about this fishing for men thing, and here's what I do for the typical person who grew up with no religion, and here's what I do for this person. And I don't think it's supposed to be that way. And I think the great way to kind of look at that is fishing back in the time of Jesus. Fishing in the time of Jesus, in the stories that we have of them fishing is completely different. There's not rods and reels and all this. They're throwing a net out there and they're catching everything that gets in the net. And it's not selective. Now, they can throw back selectively, but it's not selective. But one net catches all the fish. One kind of net catches all the fish, essentially.
Yeah,
and it's interesting from that standpoint to think.
I think we've kind of shifted sport fishing from commercial fishing.
Correct.
And for commercial fishing, while it has changed and advances, we track the schools of fish, and we do a lot of different stuff now. We also breed and farm fish. The methodology is basically I go to where the fish are and I cast the net, and whatever comes up, that's the fish I've got today. And if I happen to have a dolphin in the net, I have a dolphin in the net. That's and you deal with it. You set it free. You acknowledge its demise. You do whatever. But this is how it goes. In the biblical illustrations of gospel spreading, they're consistent in that you spread it into an environment that is mixed, where you're going to get a mix of need and a mix of response.
Yeah.
And so. One of the questions that kind of came in this context recently is historically and culturally, one particular societal issue has shifted a lot in our lifetimes and a little bit before, and will probably continue to shift going forward. And that's the way people approach the relationship of marriage. I grew up on the West Coast, and so growing up on the West Coast, I was very familiar with friends and family members who dealt with divorce and remarriage in a variety of ways. Some full-on invested into doing things Bible ways. Some full-on invested to not caring about Bible things. And that produced a fount of random outcomes. And so that's just like, I'm familiar with it. I'm accustomed to that. Cultures in the southeastern United States, they did all the same things. They renamed a lot of them. They called them different things, but the statistics are actually kind of similar.
Yeah.
We just kind of, they're rebranded to be more southern in the southeast. We call them new things.
More palatable in our minds is all that's about. But it's the same act.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about specifically, the article that we saw, which was in, I think, Christianity Today, was about the increase in cohabitation. And I do think one of the things that's interesting, just to kind of give the context, is that we see that happening more openly among even some more notable Christians, and I use that term very loosely, in people that you probably wouldn't see before. So that spurred this article on. And the question was, how do you deal with that? And that gets to this idea that I think is really great, which is when it comes to evangelism, how do we handle these kind of things? What do we do? I will tell you, first off, I don't think the answer is to not talk to people in these situations. And I think sometimes that's our first response. Look, we've all been there and found out somebody's been divorced or remarried 4 times. Right? And our initial response to that is to say, well, I just don't want to deal with that at all. I'm just not going to talk to them because it's messy, it's sloppy, it could be difficult. The problem with that is you've decided, you've made the decision not to offer them the gospel of Jesus Christ. You've made the decision not to give them what they need to hear. And I'm not very comfortable making that decision. And so I think the first thing, and you and I are definitely in agreement with this, Phil, the first thing is just to say the solution to these issues is not just to ignore the person and not teach them. That's a terrible decision.
Right, and so that's like, the process you've got to accept. Like, hey, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to discuss this with them. Cole McDaniel asks the related question, one net for all fish. How do you become all things to all men in that context? I'll say two things to that. Number one, Paul's statement in that area is not a panacea that solves all problems.
Correct.
That talks about his willingness to personally adjust what he does, says, and engage in to the benefit of all. If you think
Sacrifice of liberties is what he's talking about.
right, but the principle still has potential value in that what you're trying to do in this one net idea or framework is to say, what is it that draws a person to Jesus? Well, Paul actually refines that to a very simplified thing. He says, he shows them the cross. And the cross draws men to the kingdom. So in that procedure of operations, if you will, the process there, you're simply just kind of narrowing down and saying, I've got to make sure that I show them the cross. And I do it in a way that allows them to individually and independently make a decision. What do I want from me? It doesn't mean you don't have the conversation. It means when you have the conversation.
Yeah.
And some stuff you don't know. Like, you literally will never know the sum total of the inside of a person's heart when you're sharing the Bible story with them. If you know, you deal with it. If you feel like it's a regular thing you're dealing with, deal with it more, earlier. Be flexible in this process. Some things you already know. If you're working, we've got a brother that Terry and I both know that does a lot of work inside prisons. He knows that those individuals are more likely to come from a background with problem X, Y, and Z.
Right.
So that means that he's going to deal with them earlier rather than later and break it down. And so I think, in answer to Colton's question there again, since you've set aside that this is not a panacea that solves all the problems, what it is okay, now I still have the one net. It's the cross. And I'm going to share it in any type of soil. It's going to season people in different ways. It's going to have a multitude of impacts to me, even every time I still tell the story of Christ. So you've got to sit down and do that with each person you meet with and just let them know, hey, early on, one of the things I specify is that I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be open, and I'm going to be plain. And for me, being plain includes being plain with the text. And so when we get to an area that deals with sin, I read it plainly, I explain what I understand it to teach, and I said, and you should think about this, especially if I know that that's relevant.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about that is, so for the all things to all men, I mean, what you do have in common is not the specific sin, but the fact that you are lost and in sin, and that the cross is the solution to that. And so there's your commonality, right? Now, I think one of the issues we have sometimes is the way we approach these different sins is we come in with kind of a form of judgment and arrogance if we're not careful. And so if I know somebody, let's say somebody's a homosexual and I know that, I'm going to come in and if I'm not careful and look down on their homosexuality, and I'm going to talk down about their homosexuality. And quite frankly, I think a lot of people, their first response, if they had an opportunity to study with somebody who is a homosexual, is not to show them the cross at all, but to show them the problems with homosexuality in the Bible. And to focus on that first. And I think that can be a mistake. We're not saying not to deal with that, but you need to show them Jesus and the cross and why this is good news before you start telling them they have to change everything about their life. If you come in and tell me I got to change everything about my life and you've not laid the groundwork for a good reason, I'm not going to change everything about my life. But if you come in first and show me the power of the cross and you get me, and then I say, well, what do I need to do? Then it's at that point that you start talking about the changes that need to be made. And I think that's the key thing. When you know somebody's been divorced, you don't start off with divorce. You still take them to Jesus. And you teach them Jesus, and you show them the love of Jesus, and you show them what Jesus offers. And then when they want that grace and forgiveness, then you talk about what that really looks like in their situation. You talk about what that really means. I have a very, very close friend who I think would not have a problem with me just kind of sharing generically his story, but when we started studying, he wanted to be baptized, and yet he was living with his fiance. And I had to, at that point, then say, I knew that. We'd been friends for a while. But we talked about that, and I said, I cannot do that until you're willing to change this about your current life. And the response to that was, well, I can't, and there's some reasons, and I didn't baptize him. But several months later, after he was married and we continued to talk, he was baptized, and he is still faithful. And he knew in that gap in between, he was lost. And look, we could say a lot of things, but he had to make the decision, all the decisions, okay? And the issue comes into play. How do I handle that? I teach him about Jesus, and when he wants to make this decision, and I know there's a problem, then I say, here's the issue. Can't do anything until that's resolved. We've seen cases, and I think, Phil, you've seen cases where somebody makes a completely different decision, and there's a very, very quick marriage that's been done at times in the office, not even the next day. And again, that person has to handle that sin the way they handle that sin, and we have to be thankful for the grace of God that when they make the decision. And by the way, he didn't get married the day after he didn't get baptized the day after he got married. There was some more study that had to go on after that. There was a follow-up. Hey, dude, let's talk about this again. So again, and by the way, I think the other thing about this, Phil, is you talked earlier about how we have different models. I think one of the things about all of this is there is not one model that works for all of this. And I think that's one of the things you've got to understand about evangelism. This is a key thing I've said for years. If you have one lesson that you think is the answer for all evangelism, you're going to fail in a lot of your opportunities. You've got to be more flexible than that, because there's different ways to handle not different sins, but just different people. Some people think differently. That changes everything.
That's the real difference. It's not that the model matters. It really doesn't as much as it's getting that out there, casting it really far, and saying, "Here's Jesus." Now, where a person is in life is going to determine, will I look to Jesus or I look to myself? And you're going to have to redirect them through the scriptures in some way to think about this again. Here's a different way to think through the same challenge, being practical. Okay, so in the Southeast and in the U.S., because I can speak more about the Southeast these days than I can the U.S. broadly, but the principle is pretty true. There's probably three actual things that divides religious groups. The first actual thing is race.
Yep.
Our churches across the U.S., predominantly in the Southeast, are very much, this is a black church, this is a white church, this is a multicultural church, which means very few white folks and a mix of other people. That's basically the reality. The second designator that comes into play in the Southeast and sometimes the rest of the U.S. is politics. This is a liberal theological or political church. This is a conservative theological or political church. Very often those designations we think are actually how they read the Bible, but actually it fills down more into how they interact with mankind and lawful government. Like that's the next layer. The third one actually fits into this bracket. How do they deal and handle with what the Bible defines as spiritual rebellion, but the world says isn't that bad?
Yeah.
And that's going to be in areas of marriage, in areas of entertainment, and in areas of how you deal with the subject of drugs and alcohol. You can almost guarantee that those are the things that create these divides. So the question is, what do we then do? Well, I can't fix how the world sees all of these things, but I can present to a person who I maybe just met or I've known for 10 years, this is Jesus. Yeah. This is what Jesus did. Here's Jesus talking about the thing we just discussed.
And I love how
disciples.
Yeah, I love how Bob put that to go along with what you're saying. I try to think my goal is building an I'll do whatever he asks view of the Savior. And I think that's what you and I are trying to say in a lot of ways is if we're really sharing the cross and sharing Jesus, that eventually we get the person to see the need to do whatever is asked in order to receive what is being offered. But we don't start off with the sacrifice first. I think that's the thing, and that's what we're trying to say. There comes a time and place to count the cost and to explain this is what it's going to cost you. but not from the jump. And I think it was Hal that talked about that a lot of people do that very deliberately from the beginning to see if it's worth their time. And the problem with that approach is you've wasted your time in like 99% of those cases, because what you've done is you've actually driven somebody away. Now, you feel justified in that because then you can say, well, they weren't really interested in the gospel anyway. But what you don't realize is part of why they're not interested in the gospel is because of the way you approach them. And that's an issue that you have to deal with. That's a very serious issue. And that's I think what we're warning against overall.
Yeah, and you could think about it in a very linear sense on the practical side again. Everybody loves the service that Chick-fil-A provides. They train everybody to provide great service by teaching them to value the person who comes in, to see them as a person and not as a problem, to see them as someone who has valid needs that they can provide beyond the chicken sandwich. That's part of their training model. Christians should just do that. Like, you should see a person, not a problem. But Christians are influenced by the world too, and so we bring all that baggage. And here's another way to illustrate it on, again, another practical level. Think about a way a person styles their hair generationally. And particularly now I'm thinking about a mature spiritual woman. She's also mature in age. We had this caricature, well, that means that, and there's like derivative terms, she's a little blue-haired old lady, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? In about 20 years, those literal blue-haired ladies are going to have literal blue hair or yellow hair or mohawks. And you've got to ask yourself the question, what matters more when I share the gospel with them? My prejudice towards what I think they should look like, or what the gospel can do with them in spite of my prejudice?
Well, yeah. So here's another barometer that I think
how pointy your hair is that the other?
Here's another barometer I think a lot of people look at, and they're going to have to figure out what they're going to do. Tattoos. Like when you and I were younger, now me, because I'm in the South, you grew up in the West Coast where everything was worse, but worse jokingly. But you know, for us, if you wore tattoos, you were either in an outlaw biker gang or you went to prison. Like, that was the two forms of tattoos growing up with in the South. That's what you thought. That's what you were raised to think. Nobody I went to church with had tattoos growing up. If they did, you never saw them, right? We're living in a culture where we have elders and preachers that are tatted up, man, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. We could, if you want to talk about that privately, we can. Or a sailor, Bob, you're right. I forgot Navy, Marine tattoos, yes. But at the end of the day, those kind of things that people used to look and pick and choose evangelistic prospects by, you can't do that anymore. And you shouldn't have done that back then, by the way. You should not have done that back then. But so it's interesting from that standpoint. And you get back to this, what we initially thought about. The real point of being fishers for men is casting the net towards everybody, regardless of whether they have tattoos or blue hair or a mohawk or ride a Harley or drive a truck or a car or live in a trailer or a tent or a big house on a golf course or wear a suit or a pair of jeans to church. Regardless of what they do, what they wear, where they're from, their education, how much money, or even their moral excellence or lack thereof, when it comes to evangelism, our job is to share the gospel. And what is really interesting is when you look at the life of Christ, the people who seem to be more interested in hearing him and actually following along with what he said were the people who had blue hair, mohawks, tattoos, and piercings, and that kind of stuff. The people we would look down upon, which is pretty interesting.
Right, and if we want to move it into the preacher context, it's like preachers who wear skinny jeans versus preachers who wear a suit and a tie. In the end, it's the person who demonstrates the life of Christ, who emulates the character of the Samaritan and the character of the transformed nature of a disciple, is what we should be kind of actually trying to raise up. But we always have these unequal standards, and evangelism exposes all of that. Evangelism opens us up to the possibility of learning to see beyond our bias, our prejudice, our weaknesses if we let it. And so, one of the things I hope to accomplish for today with this conversation is just putting the seed to say, okay, when you go teach next, look at them in the way in which the gospel can see them, rather than the way that you want to. Because you'll notice something in the congregations you're part of. Everybody ends up being more like one another, which is accurate. It should be that way because you're more like Christ. But how diverse is the spread of spiritual background and baggage that's coming in? If it's not very widespread, that doesn't mean you failed. It means something else. It means, as in my judgment, you're not spreading your net far enough. I mean, maybe your community is small, maybe the group area, but if that's not the case, then it just simply means there's some spots where we can throw the net that we haven't been throwing yet. Let's go throw it there and see what we bring up. I think it's a better way to approach it than some of the other corners that we might dig into.
And I think one of the things to talk about evangelism is when you're really doing evangelism this way, it is kind of messy. Like, I think that's one of the things to point out is you go save the lost, you're going to have a lot of things come up that you may not be used to, especially depending on your background. That doesn't mean you try to clean up the mess before you teach anybody. That doesn't mean you try to weed out the messiness by not converting those lost. That's not what you do. And I think that's the challenge in all of this.
And you really can't.
No.
There's no on-off switch for any of that. One of the phrases that I kind of include in the space between a evangelistic conversation and a new disciple conversation is, remember that transformation into Christ is not behavior modification.
Yeah.
And you say, well, don't I change my way of living? You absolutely do. But it's different than behavior modification. And the more you understand that, I'll suggest that the more successful you become at your goal of transformation. So again, in this evangelistic box, if you will, remember that core concept. If your goal is to cast the net, then bring the net. Don't bring the fishing rod, to go back to Terry's early illustration, because that's just not the model. It's not because you can't fish and get one fish. It's just not what the gospel really is looking for us to accomplish. Like, let's spread it really far. Let's get a broader spread, a broader opportunity. And here's the other outcome. The more you do that, the more you'll find your time being spent in ways that are the consequence of that behavior. You throw your net out, you're going to be bringing more fish in, which means the group is going to grow. It means you'll grow. It means everything that God wants to have possible takes place, and that may also mean numerical growth. That may also be the outcome.
Absolutely.
That's kind of what we had laid out for today. Real kind of simple. We're hoping it's encouraging to folks. I think it's something important to respond to, because look, it's going to shift. Right now it's marriage issues. 10 years from now it'll be something else. 30 years from now it'll be something else. The gospel's always going to have this stressful interaction with the world around it.
Always has.
It's always has. It always will be. Any last thoughts, Terry, before we close off for today?
I think the key to all this is just to love the lost. And I think that's probably, we didn't talk a lot about that. We talked more about methodology and casting a net, but that's all rooted in just a deep-rooted love for people who are lost. And I think that's the key. If you can learn to love people the way Jesus did and see them the way Jesus did, then you'll cast a broader net, and you won't approach them with this kind of idea of a selection process, but rather an opportunity to share the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ with everybody, because you want everybody to be saved. And I don't know that we intentionally don't love other people when we do this. I think we have what we've come to describe as justifiable reasons. But I think what we need to learn is that the result, whether we realize it or not, is that we are not loving other people the way Jesus does. And that's really the key.
Now, here's another way to think about it, and this is my closing commentary, may be encouraging. When information like that comes up in a study and a conversation, What is your response? If your response is to get angry or even to be perceived as being angry, then I'll suggest that you've taken the place of God's seat.
Yeah.
And here's why. I would suggest that our hearts should shift in a different direction. We should weep for and with someone when they open up their lives in that way. And you see, hey, look, it's a mess. It's complicated. It's going to be hard to figure out what they need to do. They're going to have a hard time to figure out what to do. Because look, if you're angry with them when you find out X, Y, or Z, they ain't going to listen to you anymore, at least for a little while. But if you weep with them, and it's real and genuine, then now you're building the open door and you're being kind of what Colton was asking about. You're being sacrificial to them. You're showing them, look, I understand. And this is going to be hard. And maybe you need to open up your home. And maybe you need to open up your wallet. And maybe you need to open up anything else that you've got to help them solve the chaos that their life might be at that moment before they get to the eye of the storm and things calm down. I want to thank everyone for jumping in today. Hope that your work as an evangelist goes well. As Terry pointed out, if you've got questions or details you'd like to know more about, send us a message. Happy to talk. But everything you do, we hope it is to the glory and honor of our Maker and our King. And may God bless you.